Hello, my name is Robert Atkinson, and this is my 10-minute oral discussion, explanation, and reflection. Introduction. I personally think that teaching history is the most important thing that we can do as citizens, because not just history and social studies is the most important thing that we can do as citizens, because history and social studies are truly the one thing that you will use for the rest of your life, no matter if you become a mechanic, a doctor, a mathematician, a ditch digger, a auto mechanic, a professional skateboarder, whatever you want to do, history and social studies will need to follow you your whole life. You'll need to know what these things are because you're going to vote on the issues at hand. You're going to vote on the politicians that will hopefully address these issues. And all the issues today have historical basis. If you don't understand why things are the way they are, then you're not going to be able to make informed decisions on how to fix them. That's just logical. And unfortunately, history and social studies is extremely boring to kids. It's disengaging. They don't care. It doesn't relate to them. They fall asleep in class, and I don't blame them because the way we teach it is awful. We teach them to sit down, read the textbook, take notes, and of course they don't care. They just see it as a bunch of facts that they have no use for, and they just don't care. I mean, it's a cool story at best, and I completely see why they do that. I believe the overall theme of the reading addresses what I believe. The overall theme of the readings is that in regards to history and social studies, autonomy and relativity are paramount in student learning. If students don't have some sort of input in what they're learning, they aren't going to care. The information also needs to be relative in that the information relates to the students. In a conversation, when the information pertains to you personally, you naturally pay more attention. What you are teaching and how much a student cares is no different. If the information pertains to the student and they can see why it's relative to them, they're naturally going to care more. This is just a subconscious reaction, and to ignore it in teaching methods is absurd, I think. To bring up the first book, Instructional Strategies for Middle and Secondary Studies, Secondary Social Studies, by Larson and Kuiper. I believe what they were trying to say in this book is the best way to get students to learn is to involve them. In Chapter 11, they talk about self-directed learning. They go on to say that you may have heard the old proverb, tell me and I forget, show me and I remember, involve me and I understand. No teaching approach is greater for student involvement and engagement than student-directed learning. I can't argue with this, and I can't agree with this more, because it gives students a sense of autonomy, like they are in control of what they learn and how they learn it. They get to pick what they learn, what is important to them, why it pertains to them, and I think that's great. I think student discovery is fantastic because not only do they learn more about the subject, but they can use it and they can use these skills in the future to do their own research and to learn on their own because they're motivated to. I think that's fantastic. In Chapter 5 of the book, it's all about group work and working with each other. And they go on to say that most research studies conclude that group goals and tasks requiring students to depend on each other, work together to attain group goals, lead to higher levels of achievement. And I think this really ties into the whole autonomy and relativity thing. Everything's related to each other. They get to choose the way that they go about learning, and it motivates them. It's not just the fact that the students are working together. It's that they're working together towards a common goal. Everything is relative to them, and they have autonomy, and they get to choose what they're learning. And I think that the theme and the Larson and Kuiper book ties into another book called Lies My Teacher Told Me by James Loewen. And the basic premise of this book is that we should move away from textbooks because they're boring and disengaging. It ties in perfectly to the theme of all the readings, in that the students need some self-direction. They need some autonomy in what they learn, and it needs to be relative to them. And textbooks, for the most part, are neither. On page 5, the book goes on to say, unfortunately, having a still bigger book, and this quote is in regards to adding more detail to make the book more fun and interesting to the kids. It says, unfortunately, having a still bigger book only spurs contentious teachers to spend even more time making sure students read it and deal with its hundreds of minute questions and details. And that's exactly it. Students don't care about fun information in a book because it's a book. It's a wall of text. It doesn't apply to them. They're not choosing what they're learning, and they need to, and it might apply to them even worse, but they can't see it because all they see is a book and words that just on surface level don't apply to them, and they don't care. On page 7, Lowen goes on to say that even though the books bulge with detail, even though the courses are so busy, they rarely reach 1960. And this is exactly what alienates students from social studies, and in this case history, is that the textbooks only reach 1960 a lot of the time. They're not relative to the students. They're not from their decade. This is their parents' generation. They're not learning how they're learning about the information, but they're not learning about how it impacts their lives personally. So they just see this as a fun bedtime story at best, just a fun fact like Lord of the Rings. They can tell you where all the great cities, all the great battles are. It's fun, but they don't see it as important. That's the best case scenario in this, and I completely agree with the book, what the book is saying here, in that it's not relative to students, and again, they don't get to choose what they learn. There's no autonomy in that, so they're not really going to care. A third book that I felt the first two tie into is Enlivening Secondary History, 50 Classroom Activities. And this book is by Peter Davies and Rhys Davies. And it's basically what it says, just 50 classroom activities that will help students learn history and social studies. They'll be more engaging to them. One of the activities I found that I thought was interesting was on page 19, and it was called the Convert-A-Text. And this is where you take a text or a document and you draw it with crayon and marker and basically any type of media. And I think this is interesting because it's self-directed. Students get some autonomy, the overall theme of the reading. They get to make it themselves. And relativity, when people draw something, they naturally draw something that's relative to them. They tie into it. They take a text from the Bible or a piece of parchment that was found at an excavation site, and they write down what they think it means to them, and they'll naturally tie this into how it affects them personally. And then, more importantly, the second part of this activity is that they share it with other students, and the other students can see how it relates to them, and they see things from a different perspective, and they can see how everything relates to everything as a whole. And I thought this was a really cool activity. I'd never done this in my high school, and I thought it was interesting. A second activity that I thought was interesting, it sounds very boring on surface level, but on page 25 it goes into charts and diagrams. And this is basically what we've been doing in our class, the Skim-C, the framing routine. It's taking the information that the teacher presents us, and we get to arrange it ourselves. We get to say, what do we think the main point is? How do we think we should go about learning this? What are the details that we find important? It gives us that sense of autonomy, and through doing this, we say it becomes relative to us. It's great. It ties in very well to the theme of the book overall, I feel like. My takeaway: how autonomy and relativity were demonstrated in my classroom, I could not hope to do this any better. What my teacher did was she gave a 10 or 15-minute presentation on the base information, and then she let them do a project on it. She had the project all set up. She gave them all the materials that they needed to do, they needed to do the project with, and they did it. They had a sense of autonomy. It was self-directed learning. It was theirs. They put in what they thought was important. They had the base information, but they applied it in ways that they thought was important, and because they did this, it became relative to them. I thought that was great. And what will I take away from it personally in my classroom? I'm going to focus from the readings, based on what I've learned, is I'm going to focus more on student-directed learning, like what's important to them, because I completely agree with the theme of the book. If you let students choose what they learn to a degree and how they learn it, they're going to care more, they're going to go more in depth about it, they're going to apply it more, and they're going to make it more relative, and they're going to make it, this makes it relative to them. If they have a choice, it becomes relative to them, and oftentimes if you let them choose a certain topic throughout history, it will be more relative to them as a person, and they'll care more. And I think this will help them understand that history is the most important. History and social studies are the most important topics that you can learn in school, and I hope it'll give them lifelong qualities that will help them find their own problems and hopefully encourage self-directed learning in all aspects of life, no matter what it is.